First indicate that we will aim to conclude at 6 o'clock today. And that does require, there are several slots after lunch, and I would want all the slots to be filled of speakers, an hour per person maximum, so that we make the progress that we should in terms of getting the debate timely delivered before we close on Thursday. I thank you in advance for your cooperation on both sides of the aisle. And now I offer the floor to the Leader of Government, the Leader of Opposition Business in the Senate, the Honorable man from Carriacou, Honorable Senator Nolan Cox. Senator Cox, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I see that you do have some maneuvering to do, but we are going to work with you.
You will help me.
As I always do, Madam President.
Indeed.
Madam President, let me first extend a warm welcome to all our visitors, especially our students who are here with us in the gallery. This is a very important exercise for our country, and especially for our young ones, as this motion before us paves the way for a number of things to happen in the country. But Madam President, I just want to commence by indicating how truly blessed I am to be here and to be endured by the mercies of the Heavenly Father, and recognizing that all things are possible through Him. Madam President, it is my understanding that the delayed presentation of this year's budget is attributed to the implementation of a new budget software and the impact, of course, of Hurricane Beryl. While the latter is indeed a significant event, it should have been an even greater reason, Madam President, for the timely preparation of the 2025 budget, given the urgent need for immediate investment in the economy to bolster an already sluggish recovery effort. Explanations, Madam President, that were provided do not justify such a delay in fulfilling one of the most critical responsibilities of the government to this nation. I remain steadfast, Madam President, in my assessment that the government attempts to achieve its so-called transformational agenda have remained very much elusive. Therefore, Madam President, my contribution will focus on the reported achievements for 2024 and the outlined plans for 2025 as provided by the estimates. One of the beauties, Madam President, of the Parliament, when we debate this motion, we do have an opportunity to transcend into the other place where the motion commences, because I think it's important for us to capture everything, as this motion is very impactful and very important. The presentation of the 2025 budget was crafted much, Madam President, like a carnival masquerade. And I say that in the context that the mover of the motion is the Minister for Culture, so I think you'll understand much more, hence the reason why I use that. And just coming off a Carriacou Carnival, I think that again will help for all to understand when I use that description, Carnival masquerade. Madam President, this budget is designed to disguise its true nature. Beneath the surface lies weak economic investment in the economy, enormous wastage, poor management, structural deficits, and an uninspiring economic outlook, Madam President. This budget does not embody the vision and hope required to propel Grenada's growth and development for the next 50. That I'm very convinced, Madam President, this budget is far short of that. Madam President, while I do not claim to be an expert in electrical engineering, I do know that faulty wiring can cause transformers to burn. Perhaps, Madam President, this is an apt analogy of the so-called transformation efforts that this government seem to be suffering from a similar fate. Madam President, the economy. The Grenadian economy has shown clear signs of slowing down. Even amid reconstruction efforts post-Hurricane Beryl, which should spur economic growth. Madam President, one of the fastest ways to grow any economy is through infrastructure development. And even with all this development that is taking place post-Beryl, we still have slow economic growth. According to the budget statement, page 11, GDP growth was 3.7% in 2024, and is projected to be a mere 4% in 2025. Those are the numbers, Madam President. So I am not speaking by guess. These figures do not inspire confidence in a robust economic rebound, Madam President. It does not. Furthermore, we had several discussions on the whole issue of deficit budget. Madam President, I think we recognize that previously budgets were presented with deficits in this place. I mean, that is a fact. While some may say that it is not an issue, but I think it's important, Madam President, to highlight some clear things. And when I said that the presentation is a masquerade, I'll give you a little example. Madam President, on page 13 of the budget statement, figure 5.2, and coincidentally, the mover of the motion, leader of government business, actually read it out. He read it. And I was surprised that he read it and said that, and I'll quote, Madam President, what he said. I am pleased to report that the 2025 budget is fully financed. Yeah? Of note, the overall deficit of 337.4 million will be largely funded. Madam President, and I stop right here. We move from fully financed to largely financed. That is a difference, Madam President. He said largely financed, not fully financed. By a sum, a drawdown of 287.3 million. Madam President, I still see a shortfall of 50 million plus. So I stand corrected for some guidance on that going forward, and where the probably next 50 million plus is coming from. So it is a deficit budget by nature and by construct. However, Madam President, when we consider historic shortfalls in grant funding and other unperforming revenue sources, this deficit can easily widen, Madam President. So it is of concern. Hence the reason why we do have a loan bill before us. Madam President, we understand the theatrics. You don't want to give the context that you're borrowing to finance the budget, but that is the case, Madam President. A well-constructed budget should not merely reflect economic parameters. It must instill confidence in the business sector, provide comfort for investors, and offer hope for families across this nation. Madam President, The member did agree with me on that. Madam President, the only area where the government seems to be overperforming or overspending is on overseas travel for the bigwigs and the czars, Madam President. You have a few czars around. Every ministry have 2 and 3 advisors. Those are the czars, Madam President. That's where the performance is taking place. And we see just in 2024 alone, a sum of $8 million is spent on overseas travel, Madam President. While we hope for success of the government's economic strategy, the reality is, Madam President, the chosen pathway continues to create some of the most challenging economic conditions for businesses, investors, and ordinary citizens alike, Madam President. Madam President, I have to respond to a few mentions by the leader of government business, and one of them has to do with the Kuwana Bay, Madam President. If I could recall clearly, this said the Kuwana Bay matter was resolved, and there is work in terms of getting investors. Madam President, if I could recall some time back, there was a ceremony, and there was also an announcement of a transfer of the Rivera lot for a said investor. And of course, that investor should have acquired the Kuwana Bay and start moving forward with the development of the property. Now we are hearing that there is search for investors. Madam President, I hope some clarity can be brought on this matter, because I am somewhat confused, because I was hoping to hear that work will commence. So maybe the Attorney General in her deliberation can speak to that, because I know the chamber, her chambers, is part and parcel of those negotiations. And it was said that the Rivera lot was going to be used for, I think, the Heroes Pack or something of that nature. So I just wanted to raise that for some clarity, Madam President. Madam President, you also spoke about the strengthening of the parliamentary offices. When I heard he spoke about increases, I really thought we were getting another increase here, Madam President, because I know we deliberated that on the last budget. So when I hear he said it, I was a little bit excited. I said more money again, but worried too at the same time. So I'm just a little bit concerned why it was raised, because we deliberated extensively on that on the 2024 budget debate. But as regards to the issue of a vehicle for the parliamentary office, I believe that has been proposed. Madam President, I could speak more with confidence in terms of Carriacou, and it's a major concern in the use of government, how government vehicles are being used. I mean, I can tell you, right now, there is clear evidence, I've seen it, government vehicles sleeping with people sleeping in government vehicles. It's like their own personal vehicles. So I think it is something that the ministry, the government need to look carefully into in terms of how government vehicles are being used and managed currently. Madam President, and I'll speak to the whole issue of unemployment in a little bit, but I want to speak to page 74 of the estimates of revenue and expenditure. And the document indicated that it shows that the table, that in terms of revenues for 2024, the government were able to amass about a 1.6 in recurrent revenue, 1.6 million in recurrent revenues in 2024, largely due to a 500 plus million revenue intake from the CBI, now branded IMA. Madam President, even with this increase in revenue, the government had serious difficulty in terms of implementing and executing some of its projects for 2024. Now we are seeing for 2025 a projection for less revenue, a drop to about 1.1 million, largely due again to a reduction in CBI and IMA projections. So I am somewhat confused, Madam President. How do they plan to achieve this? With less revenue, with less time to implement the budget, we are almost in Lent, we're getting ready for Easter. Madam President, I think the first quarter is getting ready to close off, and we have not commenced any implementation of the 25 budget as yet. So I am confused. How are we going to achieve what we seek to do with less funding and less time to implement? I think that is something that should be you remember I said, Madam President, masquerade. Masquerade, Madam President. Madam President, you know, one of the things that stood out to me from the presentation is the issue of the Imani, and I want to take it up front. And sometimes, if you are not in a position to understand the challenges and limitations of some of our young folks and what the Imani program would have provided for them, we are not saying that the program is perfect. We are not saying that the program didn't have challenges. But, Madam President, to say that the program gave a false assurance is a false statement. Madam President, the young men and women who are now chefs today, the young men and women who are now engineers today, the young men and women who are working in various institutions and organizations who came through the ranks of the Imani program, I don't understand how are you saying that their achievement through the program is one that give a false assurance. I don't get it. I don't understand it. Madam President, this program, with all its inadequacies, would have created immense opportunities for a number of young men and women in this country, and that's a fact, Madam President. Madam President, employment. Madam President, in reviewing the medium-term fiscal framework and other related reports, Madam President, this paints a very troubling picture for our nation's economic management. And some of the key issues that stand out, Madam President, is rising debt and poor fiscal management. Madam President, the debt to GDP is projected to reach 57.1% by year end, in due part. That's government's report to BER's response. Madam President, I am saying this in the context that a member presented that debt is going down. But the document presented by the Ministry of Finance saying that the debt is increasing. So I am not sure if the presenter of the motion, Madam President, actually saw this. So I wanted to raise that so that he understands that debt is not going down. Debt is increasing. That is the Ministry of Finance projections. And Madam President, this debt is increasing despite this government receiving $118 million payout 14 days after the hurricane. Despite that, debt is still increasing. Madam President, this raises serious questions about the fiscal responsibility and management at this current time. Madam President, inflation. The issue of inflation has continued to be a thorn, not just in the backs, but in the pockets of every citizen, especially persons living in barrier-ravaged communities. Madam President, the reports state that the same medium-term fiscal report states that food inflation remains high at 3.6%. Steep food prices rises while fuel inflation saw a modest decline. Madam President, those are the words of the Ministry of Finance. Not my words. That is the words of the Ministry of Finance. It is clear that inflation is an issue of major concern. And Madam President, I heard in the presentation, in the budget statement, and I smile because I recall, in terms of the fiscal measures to deal with inflation and cost of living, last year's presentation, and in the Minister for Finance reading out the fiscal measures, the one that got the most attention was the removal of VAT and condoms, Madam President. This year, the one that really had the chamber ruling was the removal of VAT and panty liners, Madam President. That is what is receiving most attention, Madam President. That is what is in the document. That is what was presented. So I'm saying this, Madam President, that look at what received the attention in terms of fiscal measures to alleviate inflation. That is what stands out, Madam President. Madam President, unemployment. And this is a very concerning one for us. And from the document on page, I think, 19 and 22, and it stated, women continue to face higher unemployment rates. I want to repeat that. That is not my words. That's the words of the Ministry of Finance. Women continue to face higher...
Excuse me. Somebody is constantly speaking and I'm hearing two voices. I'm not sure where that is happening. Sorry.
That's all right.
Only one speaker should be heard, and that's because only one speaker should be speaking. Thank you. Continue.
Thank you, Madam President. Women continue to face higher unemployment rates of 15.8% compared to men 7.2%. Youth unemployment, again, Madam President, youth unemployment crisis persists, within the ages of 15 to 24 suffering the highest rates of joblessness in this country. Those are not my figures, Madam President. That is the figures of this government, this administration, this Ministry of Finance. So I'm only stating what you presented here. So, Madam President, I hope I do not get any knock for that. I didn't make up these numbers, Madam President. Madam President, I said in the context that this government tout investing in young people. They tout putting young people first and investing in them now. But the numbers do not reflect, Madam President. Masquerade. Madam President, little or no progress has been made since the 2023 Labour Force Survey, showing a clear lack of strategic intervention. Madam President. Madam President, on page 12 of the same document, and that has to do with the investment by migration. Madam President, it is important for us to look at these numbers. It's important for us to highlight them in context of what is taking place or what is not happening. So this, Madam President, the newly rebranded IMA, formerly called the Citizenship by Investment Program, reported a whopping 58.5% revenue increase in 2024. Some 553 million plus collected, Madam President. But what is most alarming, not a single new project, Madam President, has been initiated. Not one single new investment. Even after having record revenues from the investment by migration, not a single investment, Madam President. So it's very concerning for me. It's very concerning. So the question is, where is the accountability? Where are the tangible benefits for persons, Madam President? Madam President, we come back to the youth. And I know that I'm not certain who might be the person might speak directly to youth on the other side. But it must be concerning for the Ministry of Youth. I'm quite certain it must be concerning. If I were the person leading the Ministry of Youth right now, Madam President, I would be concerned. I've been very honest. I've been very honest. We've seen, Madam President, what is presented. A 31.5% cut in youth investment. That is the numbers. I am not making these numbers up. There might be some other investment. I don't know. But I'm only presenting what is before us, Madam President. The Division of Youth budget was slashed by 14.2 million. And that is equivalent to that percentage among that I highlighted. Madam President, and the question is, what is the message are we sending if less investment is made in young people? How we expect to address youth unemployment? How do we expect to create opportunities for young people without investing in them? And that is the question. How are we going to do this? I say masquerading. Madam President, these figures that we are seeing signal one thing. It signals that we need immediate and urgent attention to address the concerns and, of course, the opportunities for young people. Madam President, this is very concerning. This is very concerning. It is clear, Madam President, and probably for want of a better word, the youths have been abandoned. Yeah, I stand corrected, Madam President, but that is how I am feeling based on what I'm seeing here. And based on what would have transpired over the past fiscal cycle, Madam President. Little or no engagement opportunity for young persons. There are no clear, specific policy initiatives, and I stand corrected, Madam President, if there are. And of course, this in itself put a hurdle, Madam President, if not a stumbling block, in the pathway of our young persons who, of course, want to realize their dreams and aspirations, Madam President. Government have a responsibility to invest in its future, which is our young people. And this budget does not reflect such. Does not reflect such. Madam President, I want to move on to healthcare. And, you know, for me, Madam President, and I'm speaking for me personally, my personal opinion, this is one of the sectors that every time I speak in this place, I am somewhat guarded as to how far I go, understanding the implications, understanding what healthcare means in the context of a nation. It transcends aisles, it transcends political parties, it transcends social class, Madam President, because we all will get sick at some point in time, Madam President. So when I stand here and make comments in the context of the Ministry of Health, I make them in an honest, genuine, and meaningful way, Madam President. And I'm saying this, that where we are right now, it is scary and unacceptable, Madam President. It is. We understand that healthcare has been a challenge, not only just for this country, Madam President, but many countries. But it's a fact that what was inherited was a good enough platform for this government to build on, but they deteriorated it, Madam President. And we have evidence to show, Madam President, to show. Madam President, time and time again, we have seen that the new National Party administration have to come and do the hard things. Deal with the difficult projects, Madam President. We have, our resume shows that we as a party in government would have made the most investment in healthcare in this country, Madam President. Madam President, you know, time is a funny thing. You know, time is a funny thing. But if there was a direct correlation between time and performance, then I could say so. But that is not the case. There are persons who hold certain positions and responsibilities for years and they have not done nothing. And there are persons who have held it in a shorter time frame and would have performed. So the issue is not about time, Madam President. The issue is about commitment. The issue is about competence. And we have shown that, Madam President. We have shown that.
I'm hearing comments.
That's fine, Madam President.
No, it's not fine.
Yeah, it's fine, don't worry.
Can we listen, take notes? School, the rules are there. We are operating under the rules of the debate. From Standing Order number 38, 41 on decorum, 42 on the duties of the presiding officers, and so on. I didn't want to discuss this. I can't follow the trend of conversation when there's a commentary in place. Can we please?
Should I continue, Madam President?
No, I'm trying to locate where because even as I'm speaking, I'm hearing the comment. So I remind our visitors, do not comment, you have to listen. You don't have the privilege of commenting. And for our colleagues, they already know the rule. Thank you. Continue.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, my colleagues knocked the table over there, you know, and I was expecting that. You know, I think they don't understand everything I do is deliberate and purposeful. Madam President, I was expecting that. And they knocked the table in the context that the National Party administration has been in government for a longer period than the NDC administration. I think it's probably coming up on 13 to 23. Madam President, but there's a reason why we were given that time, Madam President. It's not my guess. There's a clear reason. Because the better choice had the longer time to serve. And that's a fact. That's a fact, Madam President. So don't get so excited, Madam President, through you, Madam President, and the other side. Madam President, we can speak of some of the achievements, because I think it's important. It's important, Madam President. It's important to address the context in which we speak as regards to healthcare. Madam President, our new hospital wing, accidents and emergency. We have a new dialysis unit. Yeah, Madam President. Diagnostic radiology unit. All those, Madam President, were the platform that was handed over to this administration, Madam President. Expanded ambulance fleet, Madam President. Upgrade in the primary health care, the Guav Polyclinic, Madam President. I mean, there is so much that we can say. The hospital in Carriacou, the health center in Hillsborough, Madam President. There is so much investment that we have made. And my colleague will expand more on health, driving more, Madam President. Madam President, the government plan to build a new hospital is commendable in principle. But let us be clear, Madam President. A new building doesn't automatically translate into better healthcare services. It does not. The core issues in healthcare are not merely physical infrastructure, Madam President, but they are more softer issues, Madam President, such as human resources, service efficiency, and unclear policy direction. Madam President, even more concerning is this government poor track record in implementing infrastructure projects. Poor track record. Poor track record. And we can list them, We can list them. This morning, my colleague, Madam President, raised the issue of the Grenville Commercial Complex. Madam President, I was Minister for Infrastructure. There was a signed contract to commence the implementation of the Grenville Commercial Complex. To this date, it has not started. And I could speak to many more. We could speak to the Molyneux project, the Molyneux landslip, which cost overruns, time overruns. I don't know what is outstanding about that, Madam President. Probably more than twice the amount, Madam President. But Madam President, when we build, Madam President, we are blamed for being a concrete government, Madam President. But Madam President, we are confident that the investment that we have made have really and truly helped this country to go. We made investment in sports, Madam President. I mean, you name it, roads and other infrastructures. Madam President, we can speak to, in the case of Carriacou, desalination plants. I mean, it's just numerous, Madam President, numerous to mention. And those things are transformative, Madam President. Madam President, the real crisis in our healthcare system today is not just about buildings, but it's about the acute shortage of medical professionals, Madam President. It is a major concern. It is a major concern. Our nurses and doctors have been forced to work double shifts just to keep the system running. It's really tough, Madam President. And what does this lead to? This overburdening of the staff has led to burnout among healthcare workers, reduced quality of patient care, long wait times for essential services, just to name a few, Madam President. So, Madam President, these are some critical issues. The calls from the public is deafening, Madam President. The public is not satisfied with our current healthcare services. They are not satisfied, especially within our hospitals and clinics. Madam President, despite the large budget allocations, last year and previous years by this administration, over the past 3 years, Madam President, the system has not worked. It has not improved, Madam President. It has not improved. And no amount of meandering can get away from that. So something needs to be done, Madam President. Something needs to be done. Even, Madam President, more shocking is the staggering under-implementation of the health budget. Last year, we had a 24 million unspent. No, last year, the year before last, we had 27 million unspent, Madam President. And last fiscal cycle, it went down a little bit to 24 million unspent. So you could see a recurring trend there, Madam President, in excess of $20 million not being spent every year in such an important sector. I thought we'd want to see overspending as we are seeing on those luxurious overseas travel, Madam President. This is consistent. This is a consistent failure. This consistent failure, Madam President, to utilize those funds effectively should serve as a warning, Madam President, as the government seeks to build this new hospital. They need to focus on why this implementation is not taking place. Maybe the pipeline might block. So we have to look into that. Madam President, I I just don't stand here and just critique, but, Madam President, I think it's important that we offer suggestions how we move forward. Madam President, in terms of a strategic approach going forward, we believe that a strategic focus will be strengthening on the primary health care, Madam President, investing in primary health care. By investing in preventative and community-based care, we can reduce burdens on hospital, we can improve early diagnosis and treatment, and provide better health care outcomes for all Grenadians, Madam President. That is what we suggested. However, given this administration's poor track record on healthcare delivery, it is no surprise that this sector continues to decline, Madam President. Madam President, healthcare is not a luxury. It is a fundamental right. And that is the words from the 2022 budget presentation. I remember, Madam President. So I just reiterate for us to remember. Madam President, infrastructure development. There is not much I can say because not much going on there, Madam President, in infrastructure development. You know, a lot of key major projects either not started on what is being worked on, is either delayed. Madam President, this is critical. You know, our roads, I don't even know where to start. And I guess as much every commuter on the roadway don't even know where to pass to as well, Madam President. We all can resonate that our roads are terrible, We have not heard any concretized plans to address them, but what we recognize is more remedial work, patching. That is what I capture. I stand corrected if there are any specific project to treat with our roadways, Madam President. I stand corrected. Madam President, you know, in the other place, there was a presentation about lights and lighting playing field. I mean, I couldn't believe. I mean, I wasn't sure I was watching the same. You know, because I recall, Madam President, in the Springs playing field, when we started digging the foundations for the poles to be erected. So I don't know how all of a sudden the lighting of the playing fields become an achievement for that individual, Madam President. Of course, he turned on the switch for the lights. I think he's mistaken in his explanation, what he really wants to say. So if he come and he said that he was able to turn on the lights, I agree, yeah, he turned on the lights. But to say that you are responsible for lighting the playing fields, Madam President, I think that is gross untruth and gross misleading the public when you do that, Madam President. And you know, Madam President, the largest playing field, that is the first playing field in the country where you can play cricket at night. I didn't hear the member who is a resident of St. David spoke about that, you know. So, but there's an effort to light the cricket stadium. But coincidentally, Madam President, there are table knocks about lighting the cricket stadium. But when the government had an opportunity to bring cricket to Grenada, they failed to invest to bring cricket to Grenada. They failed. Cricket was right in St. Vincent. I mean, we have a state-of-the-art cricket stadium, and you want to bring a cricket game to Grenada. Madam President, from reports, support and investment in cricket in this country is at its lowest. It's at its lowest. So I don't know what is all this excitement about lighting the playing field, the stadium, the cricket stadium, when your actions are not in line with such, Madam President. You know, Madam President, the member who was presenting about the lights, you know, in the other place, and he was going down the line of achievements. You know how I laugh. He was using the word check and check and check. Madam President, I laugh because I know he's familiar with checks, you know. I don't know if he's that type of check, but I know he's very familiar with checks. Maybe the robbery ones, Madam President. So I find it very, very interesting that he used the word check, you know. So I just wanted to raise that. Yeah, Madam President. Madam President, I want to move to agriculture, Madam President. And my colleague is here, and I'm certain that he will have a painful time presenting for agriculture. And you see, he's despondent where he's. I'm looking at him right now, Madam President, and he's not even well. He don't even know where to look, what to look. He ain't seeing anything for the farmers. You know, but I just want to say that. Well, Madam President, it's important to commend the government in areas that they would have done well, and of course, in terms of the payouts, the direct income to farmers and fishermen, I think that was quite in line and very much needed, and I think that was a very good initiative to help the farmers. However, and we'll probably speak more about that when we get under Carriacou and Matnick, because it's a totally different picture out there, you know, Madam President. But there are some farmers and fishermen who have indicated or reported that they may have been missed out. I hope not intentionally, and so the ministry, I believe, is working to address that. Madam President, agriculture remains one of our nation's most critical economic assets, of course. And there is a clear lack of vision and leadership in this sector currently. Madam President, I think agriculture is at a critical juncture where there needs to be deep thinking as to how we should shape agriculture. What should agriculture in Grenada look like going forward? And I think that is where the conversation should be. As much as the conversation is around vehicles and how to restrict vehicles coming in, Madam President, I think a conversation should be had for agriculture. And just to go in a little bit in the vehicles, Madam President, you know, Grenadians, we love vehicles. And I am not quite certain that restricting it to 3 years may really alleviate the issue of more vehicles coming in. I'm not quite sure. Like, for example, certain things, certain commodities like alcohol, cigarettes, no matter how much the taxes go on them, sales continue to increase. So, Madam President, even if we say no used vehicles coming into Grenada, I'm quite certain that we'll find a way to buy new, to bring in new. So that may not be the issue, the matter to address, the issue of the congestion of the roads, Madam President. But we may also have to look at the issue of additional roadways, maybe a new highway, a new bridge, whatever the case may be, supplementary roads to help alleviate the traffic. I just raise it for what is what, Madam President. Madam President, I must acknowledge and express support for the government importation of the new breeding stock to help improve livestock production, and particularly so important for Carriacou and Petit Matnick, because livestock production is one of our key pet peeves, Madam President. This is a positive step, but it stands as an exception rather than the rule. The implementation of key projects in the ministry, Madam President, the Ministry of Agriculture, continues to fall below standard. Madam President, underperformance has become the norm, and this is clearly reflected in the budget execution. For example, Madam President, 2 million was allocated to boost the poultry sector, yet less than half was invested. At the same time, Madam President, and this is important for us to understand, and maybe to reiterate what government ought not to be doing. At the same time, Madam President, we're seeing excessive spending in excess of $8 million in overseas travel for the big wigs and the czars, Madam President. Madam President, even more alarming, despite the rising demand for eggs and poultry products, Madam President, you know that there is a current outbreak of bird flu in some countries currently. The cost of eggs in the United States is so much so that families are coming out and saying that, look, 3 weeks now, somebody was in an interview, say 3 weeks now I haven't eaten any eggs. So now they actually go into the store and not buying a dozen eggs, but buying 2 and 3 eggs, 4 eggs, Madam President. That is the reality. So even with that, Madam President, in some countries, the 2025 budget for poultry was cut by 50%. That's it. I'm helping my Steve Ramley Trees papers, Madam President. I tell you, I know he has a lot to chew of this. This is a contradiction to what is required, Madam President. Given the global and regional food security concerns, I think this needs to be looked into. Madam President, cannabis. And I think it's very important that I raise the issue of cannabis. Because I can remember in this honorable place, Madam President, my leader for government business, he thought we're going to fully legalize, Madam President, we see a major policy shift in how this government plans to treat with the cannabis industry. Madam President, the NMP administration was very clear on our position regarding cannabis. We had done our research, we had done our consultations, and one that it was aligned with national development priorities, society concerns, and values, Madam President. And after careful deliberation, we chose the path of decriminalization and not full legalization. As this current administration once boasted that it would implement full legalization of cannabis. Today, Madam President, however, the NDC government has followed our approach. Opting for decriminalization rather than full legalization. And we commend them for seeing the light. We welcome this decision, as our administration has always taken steps, Madam President, by introducing necessary legislation, and we do have the legislation was laid at the Parliament, and I think it read the first time, so it's here, Madam President. It's with the Parliament. So we have already made a significant step towards addressing that. Madam President, the sector, the economic indicators paint a very grim picture, Madam President, for agriculture's performance. The Central Statistics Office, Madam President, shows that greater food exports in 2024 fell by 37%. And we understand some of the impact, Madam President. Some of the impact had to do with, of course, some natural weather conditions. We had some heavy rains. We had a prolonged drought period, Madam President. So we understand there's some impacts that is attributing towards that. But it does not take away from the fact that it's an area of major concern. The medium-term economic fiscal strategy report shows, Madam President, that the average drop in agricultural production is as much as 25%. But, Madam President, our farmers continue to lose confidence. Farmers across this country continue to lose confidence in the ministry's ability to deliver on their needs. One of our most pressing challenges remains access to agricultural financing, Madam President. Farmers continue to face hurdles for securing funding from the GDB, only to witness politically connected individuals receiving millions with just a phone call and political leverage, Madam President. We believe this is unfair. Madam President, I am very tempted to use some Trump nickname as we go along, Madam President. But, you know, we will probably leave some of that for another time, Madam President. Madam President, and the question is asked, is this fair? Is this fair for our farmers to have such difficulty in being able to access financing for development? Madam President, the issue of Pridia Lassini, and my brother here, I know that he doesn't know where to start today. I don't know. Madam President, Pridia Lassi continues to be a major issue, and I believe that there is a clear opportunity for the government to do more to support the farmers in this sector. Madam President, there were numerous discussions around the whole issue of the Sargassum seaweed management, and government failed, Madam President, to spend and allocated $600,000 to address this critical issue that was allocated. And not just failed to spend, but Madam President, ironically, we hosted an international symposium on Sargassum, and we had a funding allocation for Sargassum, and we didn't spend a cent. But we took the lead. We set ourselves as the leaders on the issue of Sargassum. And we have not done anything, Madam President. I know that there was a lot of talk about the nets trapping the Sargassum outside, Madam President, and I know also there was another recommendation to use the Grand Lake crane trucks to hold the mango tree and shake the mango tree and collect the mango. I mean, oh gosh. Anyway, but Madam President, you know, I say this because sometimes those statements are made and we do not listen and pay attention in terms of the practicality of getting those things done. And it goes back to the word of being masquerade, Madam President. However, Madam President, the issue of Sargassum still remains a critical issue. Climate resilience. Madam President, when it comes to climate resilience, this situation is equally disappointing in terms of performance. Of the $4.4 million budgeted for climate resilience and the Agriculture Integrated Management Project, not a single cent was spent. Remember, Madam President, I stood in this House in 2022 and I said the plan to establish a ministry for implementation was not needed. What is required is, and I stand today and I maintain that, Madam President, a strong department for implementation can do as good a job or even better than having the expense of a new ministry, Madam President. I stand on that. What is the implementation rate for 2024, Madam President? I think it'd be good for us to know, Madam President. Despite food security being under serious threat, $359,000 was spent of 9.1 million budgeted, Madam President. Those are the numbers. We are not making them up. Yeah, if we make them up, it's because the Ministry of Finance make them up. And if we make an error, it's because it's an error on their part, Madam President. Madam President, how does the government justify this level of implementation failure? That is the question. How do you justify that? And my brother, I see messaging somebody. I think he might call up the farmers right now, Madam President. In hearing this is just a snapshot of what is before us, Madam President. Madam President, where is the pipeline ministry? I don't know. Where is the ministry that is responsible for ensuring that these projects are implemented? Where is the ministry? I don't know, Madam President. Failure to implement these critical programs is both alarming and unacceptable, Madam President. Unacceptable. Marketing National Importing Board, Madam President, was promised to be fully operational by June 2024. The farmers are still waiting. We understand the intricacies of what is taking place. And however, farmers are very concerned. And we hear, what is more concern for farmers is that we heard whether or not this new initiative, what was announced, what was once Madam President, what was once the Farmers Depot, which meaning marketing board, is an assured market for most of the produce, is now being repurposed into a private sector entity. And this raises some critical concerns, and I think the government has a responsibility, if it can do so during this sitting, to give some more information so we can ease the concerns of farmers and ease the concerns of my dear brother on this side. And some of those critical questions, Madam President, is how will this new company serve the needs of our farmers? Will the farmers have the same level of access to markets as they did before? What are the safeguards in place to prevent exploitation of small farmers? Those are some of the pivotal questions that is before us as we move towards this new private sector-led entity. So, Madam President, there are more questions than answers. While farmers continue to struggle with market access and face uncertainty in their future, Madam President, agriculture is the backbone of our economy, but the government has consistently failed to provide the support and leadership that our farmers desperately need. This cannot continue, Madam President. We need to fix this. We need to fix this. Madam President, I want to go into Carriacou and Petit-Martinique and in the context of burial, Madam President, because I think the basis for a lot of the actions that this budget and how it is constructed, it is based on the burial recovery, Madam President. Madam President, the government, in its wisdom, decided to suspend sections of the FRA so as not to be paying servicing the debt. But it's important for us to let the public know that suspending of the debt doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be paid. It will have to be paid at some point in time, Madam President. But what is most contradictory is that the government take these initiatives to strengthen its hand from a fiscal standpoint. But at the same time, the government has reinstated VAT on building materials in Carriacou for persons who are still unable to build a roof. And that's a fact. Go to any of the hardware stores right now, and they will tell you that they were informed that VAT will be reinstituted. So, the measure that the government currently have in place where somebody receives $15,000 worth of material, Madam President, that now will worth about $12,000. Once VAT is applied to it, that person will only receive about $12,000 plus support. That is the implications that it is having. So I'm saying this, Madam President, so that as by the time Thursday's session finish, we should see an announcement that VAT has been removed for persons on building materials in Carriacou. Madam President, the people of Carriacou and Petit-Martinique continue to persevere and demonstrate resilience in the aftermath of Hurricane Beryl. Madam President, I stand here as a kayak, and my connection to the people of Carriacou and Petit-Martinique, both home and the diaspora, is deeply rooted. And you know why? What I love about it, Madam President? It is not rooted on any political preference, but on genuine passion and love and unwavering commitment to our shared progress as kayaks, Madam President. That is the relationship that we have. Madam President, while we have remained strong, the full impact of Hurricane Beryl only beginning to unfold right now, Madam President. Our communities, families, and loved ones continue to grapple with severe housing challenges. Displacement, skyrocketing rebuilding costs, rising food and service prices, water shortages, financial hardships, and notably emotional stress, Madam President. I'm highlighting this, and some of these is what is consistent with a post-disaster, Madam President. So we are no stranger to it. And I'm saying this in the context for the government to understand and appreciate what is really taking place. But a lot of what is happening, Madam President, and we'll dive more into that, is a bit misleading to some extent, Madam President. The impression that is given that everything is all good and well in Carriacou, Madam President. We are reopening, we are building, we're rebuilding, and we're coping. But Madam President, every time somebody comes to Carriacou for the first time, their utterance to me is that, Cox, you know, I really thought he had more roof that were fixing. I didn't realize so much people in this situation still. That is the constant utterances. And I'm quite certain there are persons on the other side who would have heard that themselves, Madam President. And that's the fact. And so I say this in the context of when we make statements about our recovery process, we should not mislead people. We should not mislead people. What that does, Madam President, it creates a hindrance where we could have gotten some support or more support. Because if I believe that everything is all good and well with you, I wouldn't look to assist you. Would I? I would not. But if I don't have an understanding that you're recovering and you have some challenges and you need support in several areas, then I can seek to help. But when you give a picture that everything is all good and well, everything is back to normal, then no one will really look to assist you. So, Madam President, I say this in the context that we have to be responsible in our utterances. Madam President, despite those challenges, we continue to adapt to our new reality, demonstrating resilience, hope, as we navigate through this slow and sluggish recovery process, Madam President. But I wish to commend the government, Madam President, for its support to our students in Carriacou and Petit-Martinique, in Tamsis in particular, and some of our secondary school students, and senior citizens in the aftermath of the hurricane, and who had to be brought down, and support was given to them. Madam President, this was necessary and needed, and I must commend them for that. But I have yet, Madam President, and I keep calling for this, to see or hear any concrete plans for restoration or reconstruction of the Tamsis Carriacou branch, Madam President. The Minister for Education is here. Maybe he might have some updates for us on the branch, because I have not seen anything on, and I haven't heard any announcement of that. That is a very important institution for our islands, Madam President, and I'm calling to ensure that we get back our Tamsis branch, Madam President. And education, Madam President, is the foundation of progress. Education is the universal key to come out of poverty, Madam President. So it is imperative that we restore and enhance that facility, not just to resume operations, but a clear opportunity to expand more opportunities, particularly in skill-based training, and that will empower more young people in Carriacou and Petit-Martinique, Madam President. So that is our call. Madam President, I urge the government to prioritize this crucial matter. Madam President, 14 days after the passage of Hurricane Beryl, this government benefited from the foresight of the new National Party administration in subscribing through the CRIF insurance facility, Madam President. $118 million. That is no small amount of money, Madam President. We cannot trivialize that. That has really given the government a strong hand for response, Madam President. And we are proud of that. We are proud and pleased that we're able to do so because of our decisions and policies. Madam President, this is one of the largest and maybe most timely and convenient form of financial support any government can receive in the aftermath of any disaster. Madam President, however, serious questions remain among the residents of Carriacou and Petit Martinique. And a lot of the question, just to put in local parlance, Madam President, is where the money gone? That is the question. And I'll expand, Madam President. And we're not implying anything. But I'm only expressing how people feel, Madam President. They believe that Carriacou and Petit Martinique getting the worst of the damages, Madam President. In relation to the amount of monies that were collected, the response and support, they believe, does not match, Madam President. That is what they believe, Madam President. That is the feeling, Madam President. While there is a recognition of some achievements, generally, the sentiment by persons is one of dissatisfaction, Madam President. And that is what is being said, Madam President. Generally, there is dissatisfaction with the pace and the effectiveness of the recovery efforts. Transparency and accountability in the allocation of these funds must be prioritized to ensure that people who are affected in a disaster receive the support that they need, Madam President. When it comes to housing support for those affected, Madam President, and I maintain that it has been ad hoc, and the reason for that, Madam President, the Ministry, NAVMA, the government has not at any point in time released any real numbers as to how much homes that were destroyed or damaged in Carriacou and Petit Martinique. Up to this date, we have not heard any real numbers. What we have heard was a guesstimation, that 90% or 95%. There is a clear opportunity, Madam President. With the real numbers, it gives you an opportunity to have a more targeted and specific response, Madam President. And so much so, we're in the age of technology. Those homes could have even been geo-referenced and tagged with the specific analysis in terms of how much person in the homes, what damage that they had, Madam President. And likewise, response could have gone easily to those. But the response, I'm telling you, Madam President, unfortunately and sadly, is going based on how they feel about you, whether or not they believe that they have your support at the next elections, your name will go up on the top of the list. If they believe that they don't have your support, Madam President, your name may come off the list, and if it stays, you will not be treated with. And that is a fact. That is what is happening in Carriacou and Petit Martinique, Madam President. And nobody can tell me otherwise. There's too much reports, Madam President. There's too much evidence to show what is happening, Madam President. Madam President, the result of guesswork, nepotism, and visible political biasness in the distribution of assistance in Carriacou. That is what is prevailing, Madam President. That is the characteristic of the very response in Carriacou and Petit Martinique. And that's a fact. That's a fact, Madam President. And we have numerous examples, Madam President. Numerous examples. Madam President, when you have over 500 water tanks or black tanks to give out to farmers. Madam President, I was an extension officer. Yeah, I know 500 registered farmers in Carriacou, Madam President. And you have bona fide farmers up to this date have not received any support in that regard, all because of perceived political preference. That is embarrassing. That is unfair and that is illegal, Madam President. Because some of those tanks were donated. They were donated and you are the recipient and a medium to facilitate the support for people in distress. Madam President, when Beryl passed, the wind and the rain fall on everybody's house tops. Each and every one of us, Madam President. And as such, this needs to stop. It needs to stop. Madam President, sometime in September, this big announcement about this new type home build back, or whatever they call it, Madam President. All right? Build back better, I think that is the name of it. It was promised some 50 homes will be delivered by December 2024. However, Madam President, as of February 2025, I think only 3 was delivered, but I think sometime last week, additional 2 or so was delivered. But here the announcement, Madam President. We have 120 houses either delivered or building. What is nonsense about, Madam President? How much house you complete and how much you have waiting to complete? What is all this rigmarole and meandering about? Tell the people how much houses that are completed, how much you have building or how much you're expecting, and matter done right there. What is all this meandering about 120 either finish or hand over? This is nonsense, Madam President. That is pure nonsense. It's just about 5 houses that is a hand over, Madam President. We ain't got to Petit Matnik yet because I did with Petit Matnik separately, Madam President. Madam President, we understand. We understand in any disaster, in any recovery, that there are going to be challenges, there are going to be issues. Because all projects are dynamic. There are things that are out of your control. But if you're working by biasness and by nepotism and political favors, you're going to have problems, Madam President. You're going to have issues. If you have a planned and properly coordinated response, where you have all the information and data, and you just put your head down and work, you are going to get results. So this thing about nitpicking, this is rubbish, utter rubbish, Madam President. I'm so disgusted about this. I think this is the most I've ever been emotional about it, because the story is just too much, Madam President. Madam President, there are persons who never had a house and they receive a house. We don't have a problem with that, Madam President. I don't have a problem if somebody receives a house now and they never had one before. But you have people, you have families that don't have, they had a house and they lost it, and either they stayed by someone, they won their tent, and just because of the political preference, you're just ignoring. And this is disgusting, Madam President. This is disgusting, and for what it was. And you know what is even more sad? Somebody stand up and say that is leadership. That is leadership? Is that leadership, Madam President? I don't know. I don't know. I am very, very, very disturbed with that. Madam President, the farmers, tell me, Madam President, what could you do with a water tank more than put it to catch water? What can you do with a water tank, Madam President, more than to put it to catch water, either to shower, to cook, or to feed yourself? So what is this thing about denying persons an opportunity to receive a catchment? Carriacou is devastated. So much roofs are gone. What is this thing? What is a black tank? I don't understand. I don't understand. People have to be calling, going backward and forth. Madam President, this really needs to be looked into. And maybe that is the reason why we probably had a change in permanent secretary. I don't know, maybe the DFL government might speak to that, why there was a sudden shift in the senior public servant in Carriacou. Maybe, I don't know. I'm just guessing, Madam President. Madam President, if this is what you call great leadership, then Carriacou and Petit Matnik in a lot of trouble. A lot of trouble. Yeah. And the question is, leadership for whom? I don't know. It cannot be for all, Madam President. Madam President, numerous bona fide fishermen whose registered fishing boat, decked out for fishing, a registered fishing boat, were damaged and destroyed. And they were denied, their names were removed from the list. And that's a fact, Madam President. The names were removed from the list. Bona fide fishing boat owners. Why do we have to do that? Yeah? Why do we have to do that? I don't get it. I don't get it. Yet, there are a number of bona fide fishermen who have not received the support and assistance. I understand that efforts have been made to remedy that, so let's hope that the fishermen get the support that they greatly deserve. And yet for all, my President, they stand up and they say, look at leadership, great leadership. Madam President, I don't know. But let's go ahead. Let's go ahead. It's a new crisis that's starting after Berlin, Madam President. It's another crisis, an internal crisis, a human crisis, Madam President. Let me go ahead, Madam President. I'll go ahead. Madam President, additionally, despite repeated advice against using our playing fields to dump the debris as debris sites, this warning went ignored, Madam President. I could see when he was down in the first field, fine, you could have get away with that. And after the calls not to use the playing fields, who tell you to say that? No, they start to use playing fields self. One after the next, they just keep throwing in the playing fields. Madam President, as a result, our playing fields remain unusable and may stay that way for a while. Even after relocating some of the debris, Madam President, I just want to say that there's only one playing field, which is the mini stadium, that was not really escaped the wrath of the debris. And the reason why they escaped is because the Samaritan's Purse Field Hospital was set up at the entrance of the stadium. That is the only reason why. That's the only reason why that field get away. Trust me, Madam President, when I tell you that. Madam President, even after relocating some of the debris to Harveyville, which has now become the main dumping site, the situation remains critical. And I heard that they were talking about, we ain't talking about the garbage anymore. Madam President, people will get tired. People will get tired because if I talk to you once, twice, 3 times, anytime you hear I ain't talking again, it's because I don't talk. It's because I'm fed up, Madam President. It doesn't mean that we're happy. It's just because I'm fed up. Madam President, and we hear a lot about 9 months. That was it. In 9 months, so much happened. 9 months, and then 98% of Carriacou cleanup. Madam President, I think the best use of those two thematic numbers, 9 months and 98%, I think the best way to describe it is by saying, Madam President, that's a fact. After 9 months, 98% of all the debris is still on the island. And that's a fact. All the debris is still on the island after 9 months. So, 9 months and 98%. 98% of all the debris is in both fields, Harveyville and Hillsborough playing field. So, Madam President, we like 9 months and 98%, so let us figure it out. Anyhow, that is great leadership, Madam President. Great leadership. Yeah, that's what great leadership look like. Madam President, I recall sometime in 2020, 2021, the former parliamentary rep for Carriacou Ampati Martinique, in her wisdom and judgment, decided to work on a project to restore the botanical gardens in Hillsborough. What? Water couldn't wash her, Madam President. Is what they say. Water couldn't wash her. Madam President, in 2025, the only place that we have suitable to host cultural events, social events, and even national events like our independence, is in the same botanical gardens. The same botanical gardens that they run down and condemn, Madam President. Madam President, I take this opportunity to thank Mrs. Kendra Magistrate for her vision and fortitude. And I leave it right there, Madam President. Unfortunately, Madam President, the development of sports on the island will suffer in the coming years. Unfortunately. Due to the natural disaster, of course, but more so because of poor decision making and refusal to listen to sound advice, Madam President. Madam President, when leaders fail to listen, the consequences are felt by the people, and that is what is happening. Hard head, Madam President, they ain't listening. Madam President, you know, I deliberated whether or not I should speak about this, long and hard, but I have to. Because you see,
Senator Cox, may I interrupt you to remind you that you're nearing your 1.5 hour.
Madam President, could I ask you for
10.
I was more like 15. Madam President, you know, as NMP, we are accustomed with the number 15, so I was really leaning to
That's why
15, you know? And more in line with the other side.
That is why I'm going to break it. This is the Parliament. You actually have 15 minutes from now if you stop.
Right, so I am guided by that, Madam President.
You have 5 minutes in your time.
Madam President, you know, I fail to understand this unnecessary posturing. Why somebody will come in this honorable place and stand up and posture about having one CXC subject? I don't know. I don't know. Madam President, I was dumbfounded. Madam President, if somebody have a situation academically and it's hurting you, concerning you, do something about it. Why are you coming here and trying to justify having one subject? Madam President, every parent wants the best for the children. Every parent. As a matter of fact, the people who are around, they want 9 and 10 subjects for the children. So I am just giving you some word of advice, Madam President. Do something with it. Don't come inside here and try to justify having one subject. Cut that out. That is nonsense, Madam President. I don't subscribe to them kind of thing. Madam President
Cox, what does that have to do with the budget?
Madam President?
The 1%, the one subject.
I am going to explain to you. A point has been made.
Connect it or
that
leave
because
it. Or leave it alone.
Yes. No, Madam President, you want clarity? I'm happy to go further.
Connect it or leave it alone?
I'm connecting it because, Madam President, the point was made about being a great leader. All right? And meaning that having one subject is great leadership and you have one subject. That is what I was. That is the connection, Madam President. Within the context of perceived achievement, Madam President. And I am saying that is not the case. And you know, Madam President, as you said that, and while we had the discussions around our greater relationship with Africa, Madam President, I think it's important that I leave an African proverb. If I could recall, I think that is best important for everybody, Madam President. African proverb, and it says, Madam President, unlike the brain, the stomach alerts you when it's empty, Madam President, and I rest my case. Madam President, we're moving to Piti Matnik, Madam President. Madam President, you know, I still have to speak a little bit on burial, because I can't let, there's another member who embarrassingly tried to make us, the National Party, response in terms of cooking a hot meal and providing washroom facilities during a disaster. You try to make it look like that's the worst thing that we can ever do. Madam President, it's so embarrassing. Tell me what is wrong with a hot meal, Madam President, after a hurricane. Tell me what is wrong with providing washroom facilities when persons don't have a home, Madam President. What is wrong about that, Madam President? But yet for all, the praising other institutions that were cooking meals. The meals had to come all the way from Grenada, Madam President. And there are reports of persons getting ill. Because remember, the food had prepared, come up with a boat, and by the time they distribute, Madam President, hours have passed. And we are talking about, we had a hot meal program, Madam President, delivering food straight off the pot, boiling hot. All of a sudden, there's an issue with that, Madam President. I said, maybe now I understand why his seat in the cabinet became vacant, Madam President. Madam President, you see, people talk about leadership, but you have to know what you're talking about, Madam President. You have to know what you're talking about. And this is crazy. You know, and next thing, Madam President, a lie. I have to dispel this lie. You know, the said gentleman said that he met me and he asked me to give him some name. That is a lie. That is a lie. The gentleman met me. And 2 matters in it. He said to me, Cox, some people, they were trying to get in touch with you for a Starlink. I just laughed. Because he knew he collected the Starlink already. And I didn't say anything because I knew that they had communication challenges, so I didn't really bother. It wasn't an issue because it's for Carriacou, so I didn't make an issue. But he came to me as if he didn't know about the item. Why are you doing that? I just laugh. You know, in my usual way, I just smile and I just brush it aside. And he said to me that he was appointed to lead the cleanup, and however he's preparing a letter to send to the leader of the opposition so that we can appoint somebody to work along with them. That is what he said to me. Up to this day, a letter never came. So when you come inside this house, don't come make up a lie on me, because it might just force me, Madam President, it might just force me to give him a Trump nickname. You understand? I will just tell you, Madam President, I'm trying to restrain myself. I'm really trying to restrain myself because I can't deal with those things.
Please try hard, because this did not happen in this house, by the way. So please,
Madam President.
You might.
Madam President, P.T. Matnick. Madam President, P.T. Matnick has received the worst of burial. The worst, Madam President. And it's very disheartening, Madam President, when you hear these stories. When you hear these stories, Madam President. Up to this date, after 9 months, Madam President, not a single home delivered to any P.T. Matnick. Not one. That's a fact. 27 prefab homes came, Madam President. There's a clear opportunity for P.T. Matnick to benefit, and they didn't. For whatever reason, I don't know, Madam President. Madam President, the people of P.T. Matnick keep calling about the issue of the jetty in Windward. After 9 months, all they're asking is just do a temporary jetty. Yes, you have plans to build a new one, but they have significantly inconvenienced. Madam President, when I pass in sometime, Asian people, then a little speedboat on the shore, trying to come out, to get out. I mean, just not making sense, Madam President. We have to fix this. The piers are there. All you have to do is just to run some long mandate and do a temporary jetty. What is this? What is it about? Madam President, the health center in P.T. Matnick. There's a lone health center in P.T. Matnick, Madam President. Why efforts have not been made to address it? We're fixing about 2 or 3 in Carriacou. Not P.T. Matnick only have 1. Carriacou have the hospital operational. You have the Hillsborough Center operational. So Carriacou is not without service. But yet for all, you're still living up P.T. Matnick. Why? That's the question, you know. Why? Madam President, on any given day, you have a rough seas. Boats have difficulty butting in town. Difficulty butting in town, which means that persons cannot go to Hillsborough. You cannot go into Hillsborough. You may have to go all the way to Harveyville. But we know what is the next best, safest port. And so I don't understand why attention has not been done to just put a temporary jetty before, because the new one is going to take time to do. Do you expect the people of P.T. Matnick to wait for another 9 months? Madam President, I think this is unacceptable. Madam President, you know, talk about leadership. Leadership. We're in the dry season, Madam President. We're in the dry season. Just let me know in 5 more minutes, please. Thanks. We're in the dry season. houses are damaged. We came from a significant dry period, Madam President. I haven't heard any single plan to address this water crisis that is facing us in Carriacou. Not a single, if you say you're leading and you're a leader, the single most important issue affecting Carriacouans right now is water, and you have not raised it. You raise your subject, yeah? And you talk about you're a leader. What leader? I don't understand. The people of Carriacou, they gave you a chance. They gave you an opportunity, despite your shortcomings. Why don't you treat them better? All they're asking for is decency, fairness. That's all. We are very simple and easy people, you know. Very simple and easy going. Because we understand our mentality, Kakabawi for Kakabawi. But you cannot, Madam President, you cannot tell me that you have a situation where you have a serious water crisis in front of us. The Nawasa plant is going to be under heavy pressure. The main pump just blew. They just procure a new one, I believe, or parts to repair it, and it's going to be under more pressure as the dry season kicks in. We haven't heard any plans to address that. It is highly likely, Madam President, that we may have to barge in water in Carriacou. It had happened in the past, and there's a strong possibility that it may have to happen again. Because it's getting serious. It is serious. And so that is where leadership should lie. It should focus on the issues affecting people. Yes, you put back some roof on some government buildings, that's fine. That's all good and well. You're getting the government service up and running. But what about the people, Madam President? They are the ones that are hurting, Madam President. So I raise this, Madam President, because I just want to single out, because I had to help the member understand what true leadership is about. Hear this, Madam President. The Samaritan Post came in with 3 portable desal units. When they were leaving, they gifted the 3 units to the government of Grenada. What did we do? We refused them. Some chap, I don't know, one day some chap called me, I don't know who he was, I think he was handling the shipping back the equipment, and he called me, Madam President, I don't even know his name, begging me to find a way to intervene so that the units can stay on island. You know what the units end up, Madam President? The Honorable Ralph Gonzalez welcomed them in Union Island. Yeah? They welcomed them there. We refused them. Madam President, that is leadership? Is that great leadership? If that's leadership, well, we're in a lot of trouble. Crapo smoky pipe, Madam President.
We're in a lot of trouble.
We are already in trouble, Madam President.
With your time, you have about 5 minutes.
Madam President. I tell you, I have a great affinity for 15, but nonetheless. Madam President, let me just close by saying this. I just want to express gratitude to all the institutions and agencies who came to our aid for burial. And that goes without saying. I'm quite certain that every Carriacouan and Petit Mandican are very happy for the support. And I think World Food Program is still on island. And so we're very, very grateful for that, Madam President. I too want to thank my party for giving me the opportunity to continue to do the work that is necessary. And of course, to be in the space where I live and thrive, Madam President, to do the work to help our people through this difficult time. Madam President, I want to thank my family, my kids. I still trying to figure out how I'm doing this, as a single parent. Right now, I see my colleague laughing. But I did thank the government, Madam President, on several instances. The Hansard can bear that, Madam President. The government has a responsibility. Yeah? And so I'm more looking at persons who came from the outside to help us. So, Madam President, is within this, I just want to thank my family, friends, and of course the people of Carriacou and Petit Martinique for affording me an opportunity to interact with them on a daily basis to ensure that we bring a better outlook than what we have in now. A better outlook. And I just want to close by saying, Madam President, through you, I don't know how you get the information across. Please tell the gentleman to stop that. Stop that. You have to behave better. You have to treat our people better. You have to be fair to Carriacouans and Petitmandicans. Cut out this arrogance, Madam President. I just want to close on that because I don't know how people take joy in cussing the police. But thank you very much, Madam President.
Thank you very much, Senator Cox. Thank you. I am not and will not take the job of messenger to Carriacou or anywhere else. But I did hear you make some recommendations, some requests for information, and I'm sure the other side is listening. Thank you for coming, madam. Thank you very much for being with us. Leader of the opposition has visited us. It's slightly after 1. We are trying very hard to stay on schedule. And so we suspended the Senate debate on the estimates for a very tight hour. If the leader of government business agrees, we will break lunch and return. We start at 2. So please assemble a little bit before 2 so we could start at 2. I thank you very much.